David Hahn was born in 1976 in the quiet suburbs of East Lansing, Michigan, the kind of town where streets curved predictably, lawns were freshly mowed, and ambition was measured in college acceptances, Little League trophies, and Saturday chores. From the start, David was not an ordinary boy. He was curious in a way that unsettled adults. While other children played sports or collected baseball cards, David dismantled toasters, examined batteries, and filled notebooks with questions about atoms, electrons, and the invisible forces that held the world together. His parents noticed early on that David was different. Quiet, polite, and polite to a fault, he had a hunger for understanding that no school curriculum could satisfy. By the age of 10, he had built rudimentary chemical experiments in his bedroom, producing harmless reactions, but honing techniques that would one day become far more dangerous. The boundaries of safety were blurred in his mind. Curiosity demanded exploration, and rules were merely suggestions. David's life as a Boy Scout became a defining chapter. Among the badges he could earn, one fascinated him above all: chemistry and nuclear science. The meticulous tasks, the tests, the mastery of small experiments, this was a world he could control, a universe of logic and law. But as he earned merit badges, the hunger for something greater began to fester. Small chemical reactions were no longer enough. He wanted more, much more. It began with smoke detectors. Inside each unit was a small amount of americium-241, a radioactive element that fascinated him. To a typical child, it was invisible and inert, but to David, it was treasure. Each detector became a component, each piece of radioactive material a step toward an ambitious dream: to build a nuclear reactor of his own, a reactor that would allow him to hold the stars in his hands, to touch the forces that governed the universe. His bedroom transformed, not overnight, but gradually, piece by piece. Beakers lined the shelves. Test tubes glimmered in the lamplight. Chemicals were sorted meticulously, with labels handwritten in precise penmanship. Safety goggles rested on the desk, though their use was inconsistent, and makeshift ventilation systems hummed faintly, carrying faint chemical odors into the air. The house smelled of curiosity, a mixture of burnt metal, ammonia, and faint ozone that lingered in the hallways. David's experiments escalated. He learned to isolate americium, experiment with thorium, and combine radioactive elements in miniature reactions. Each success was intoxicating. Each failure was a lesson to be studied and corrected. He read textbooks far beyond his grade level, poring over diagrams of atomic structures, nuclear decay, and chain reactions. Each page fed an obsession that no punishment or lecture could curtail. At school, he was quiet, even unassuming. Teachers noticed his aptitude but could not comprehend the magnitude of his obsession. He would spend hours after class experimenting with chemical reactions in makeshift labs hidden behind closed doors, always calculating, always measuring, always imagining the moment he would succeed in creating something extraordinary. By the time he reached high school, the suburban house that had once seemed normal had transformed into a site of clandestine experimentation. Chemicals were stored in basements and garages. Notes covered every available surface, and small radioactive materials were tucked away like precious jewels. To the outside world, David Hahn was a brilliant but awkward teenager. To himself, he was on the brink of discovery, the edge of a world that very few humans had ever touched. And yet, beneath the brilliance lay a shadow, isolation. Friends came and went, but few could match his obsession. The Boy Scout troop, the neighborhood, even family members were left behind as David journeyed deeper into atoms, radiation, and the dangerous allure of nuclear power. The line between ambition and obsession had begun to blur.
What started as curiosity would soon escalate to a project so extreme it would attract the attention of federal authorities. The seeds were sown. The boy from East Lansing was no longer just curious. He was a young man chasing the most dangerous dream imaginable, one that would bring him to the edge of scientific genius, legal peril, and personal catastrophe. David's obsession grew exponentially after discovering the potential of radioactive materials. The smoke detectors he scavenged from neighbors' homes were only the beginning. Each unit contained a minuscule amount of americium-241, but to David it was gold. He meticulously disassembled each detector, carefully extracting the radioactive powder, storing it in labeled containers hidden in his bedroom and basement. The smell of ozone mixed with chemical residues permeated the air, a silent testament to his experiments. He began to combine these materials with other elements: thorium from camping lanterns, small quantities of uranium from industrial sources, and chemicals purchased under the guise of school projects. Each experiment was carefully logged in notebooks filled with hand-drawn diagrams, calculations, and observations. David's handwriting became a visual map of his obsession, neat, precise, and obsessive in detail. The house itself transformed. The basement, once a storage space for bikes and holiday decorations, became a lab. Workbenches covered with beakers, flasks, and vials were arranged with precision. Improvised fume hoods vented noxious gases into the open air. Lights flickered from small electrical experiments, and the faint hum of homemade circuits filled the space like a heartbeat. Neighbors noticed a strange glow through the basement windows, a faint greenish shimmer from small luminescent reactions. Faint chemical odors drifted into the yard. Yet no one suspected the magnitude of what David was attempting. He was methodical, calculating, almost clinical in his approach. As he refined his techniques, the scale of his ambition expanded. The plan was no longer simple experiments. He wanted a nuclear reactor, a working reactor, a source of controlled radiation that would allow him to study atomic reactions firsthand. This was no longer curiosity. It was a full-scale operation, a personal pursuit of power over nature itself. David scoured scientific literature, textbooks, and obscure journal articles. He memorized isotopes, half-lives, decay chains, and radiation signatures. He plotted potential experiments, calculating the energy output of each combination, imagining the reactor's glow, the hum of radiation vibrating through the floorboards. Every step carried danger. The smallest miscalculation could produce chemical burns, fires, or uncontrolled radioactive exposure. David understood this intellectually, but his obsession drowned out caution. The risk was part of the thrill. Each near disaster, each small failure was meticulously analyzed and corrected. Isolation became complete. Friends drifted away. Family tolerated his eccentricities, but remained unaware of the radioactive experiments occurring in the basement. School became less a center for learning than a way station for supplies. Chemicals, equipment, and rare radioactive elements were acquired through mail orders and local scavenging. By 1993, David had amassed enough radioactive material to attract attention without realizing it. The americium and thorium he collected, combined with small amounts of uranium, had begun to irradiate the basement walls. Small Geiger counters, purchased out of curiosity, registered rising counts. Yet David saw this as a badge of progress, proof that his reactor was becoming real.
The quiet streets of East Lansing had no idea that a storm was brewing in one of its modest homes. David Hahn's experiments, once hidden behind closed doors, had begun to leave traces. Radiation levels in the neighborhood were rising, subtle at first, barely detectable to anyone without proper instruments. But for a federal agency trained to detect anomalies, it was enough to spark concern. David was oblivious to the looming attention. He was consumed. Each day brought new experiments, new combinations of radioactive elements, and new methods to contain and measure them. Small fires, chemical fumes, and faint glows became routine. To him, danger was a calculation, part of the thrill, a tangible measure of how close he was to achieving greatness. Then came the near disasters. One night, a small container of uranium powder cracked under pressure, the air filled with fine particles. David, working alone, inhaled some of it before realizing the risk. Panic hit him briefly, but he quickly rationalized it, meticulously documenting exposure levels, the thickness of shielding, and the distance from the radioactive core. The reactor, though primitive, was unstable. The americium and thorium combined in unpredictable ways, and every measurement carried the potential for disaster. Neighbors noticed strange smells and occasional bright flashes through the basement window. Rumors began circulating. Is he making fireworks? But none suspected the half-life and decay chains at work inside. By 1994, David's experiments had drawn the attention of local authorities. The fire department was dispatched to investigate chemical odors in the house. Radiation readings were taken. Alarms went off. It was the first official recognition of the danger, and it was only a matter of time before federal agencies intervened. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, soon joined. Inspectors arrived with Geiger counters and protective suits, walking cautiously into a world that David had meticulously built. His basement, once his sanctuary, was now a hazard zone. Containers of radioactive material were removed, surfaces decontaminated, and the house sealed in some areas. David's obsession did not abate. Even in the face of federal scrutiny, he continued to imagine experiments, reactors, and nuclear processes. Each question, each calculation, fed the fire of his ambition. But the reality of danger was undeniable. Exposure to radiation had already impacted his health. Skin irritation, nausea, and fatigue were warnings he could no longer ignore. The cleanup itself became a spectacle. Specialized crews, clad in hazmat suits, worked for days to remove radioactive contamination. Neighbors watched, curious and fearful, as lead-lined boxes and barrels were carried out. Media coverage began to emerge, transforming a suburban chemical obsession into a story of national concern. David was interviewed briefly, explaining his fascination with nuclear science, his love of chemistry, and his dreams of experimentation. But to authorities, it was a cautionary tale. A teenager's obsession had escalated into a public hazard. Even as legal and environmental interventions curtailed his experiments, David remained fixated. He had touched the boundaries of nuclear science, felt the hum of radiation, and glimpsed the power of atomic reactions firsthand. But the thrill had a cost. The house, the neighborhood, and David himself had all been exposed to dangers that could not be undone.
After the EPA and federal agencies dismantled his experiments, David Hahn's life entered a quieter, yet no less complicated phase. The suburban boy who had once dreamed of harnessing nuclear power now faced a world that understood the danger he had created. The cleanup of his house became a cautionary tale for the public, a suburban nuclear experiment that had nearly spiraled out of control. David's fascination with chemistry and physics never disappeared, but the stakes had changed. He was now known not only for brilliance and ambition, but for recklessness and hubris. The community that had once been unaware of his secret experiments now treated him with caution and curiosity. Parents whispered to their children, and local media revisited the story for years afterward. He moved through adolescence with a heightened awareness of consequence. The chemicals, the radioactive materials, and the tiny reactor had left a mark, both physically and psychologically. Skin irritation, long-term exposure concerns, and the burden of national attention weighed on him, but they could not entirely extinguish his scientific curiosity. Despite the interventions and warnings, David continued to experiment, more carefully, more quietly, and more safely. His ambition evolved. Where once he sought atomic reactions in suburban basements, he now studied chemistry, physics, and environmental science in structured academic settings. He applied the lessons of obsession, risk, and consequence to safer, sanctioned projects, yet the shadow of his teenage experiments lingered. The story of the Radioactive Boy Scout became a legend, a symbol of the fine line between genius and danger. Scientists, educators, and journalists cited his experiments as both cautionary tales and inspirations, illustrating what curiosity, determination, and obsession could accomplish when untethered by experience or guidance. David Hahn himself reflected on his teenage years with a mixture of pride and regret. Pride in the brilliance he had demonstrated, the discipline he had shown, and the ingenuity he had displayed. Regret for the risks, the danger to himself and those around him, and the nearly catastrophic consequences that had only been narrowly avoided. His story continued to resonate because it was relatable yet extreme. Every ambitious mind has tested boundaries, questioned limits, and sought to grasp knowledge beyond their years. David Hahn had done so literally, dangerously, and visibly. His experiments serve as both an awe-inspiring testament to human curiosity and a warning about the cost of unbridled obsession. In the end, David Hahn did not destroy the world, but he brushed against its atomic edges. He demonstrated how intelligence without caution can become perilous, how ambition can blind even the brightest mind, and how childhood curiosity, when magnified, can ripple into national significance. The suburban streets of East Lansing returned to their quiet routine. Houses were repainted, lawns mowed, and life moved forward. Yet in that one home, in the memory of a teenage boy who almost held the power of the atom in his hands, the world glimpsed both brilliance and danger intertwined. David Hahn's story is a reminder: genius can inspire, obsession can elevate,
and ambition, if unchecked, can bring consequences far greater than the dreamer ever imagines. And in the end, that boy, the radioactive Boy Scout, left a legacy, one part caution, one part wonder, and entirely unforgettable.
If you enjoyed today's video, we thank you very much. Please like and subscribe to Rare Breed Chronicles. And let's dive into another story that defies the ordinary.